Hello and welcome to Troon Talk, where we dig deeply into biodynamic and regenerative organic agriculture and winemaking at Troon Vineyard in Oregon's Applegate Valley. Joining us today are our Director of Agriculture, Garett Long. Hello, Garett.
Hello, thank you again.
And our very special guest from Demeter USA, our Director of Certification off in Nebraska right now, where he lives, is Evrett Lunquist. Welcome, Everett.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So, could you tell us a little bit about your background and how you ended up being a biodynamic farmer in Nebraska?
Well, that's a complex multiple answer question. Uh, how I became a biodynamic farmer started with my initial look into agriculture. I was studying in college and just kind of started figuring out over time that I wanted to be a farmer. That, had lots. I started out wanting to fly airplanes for Northwest Airlines, which is now United, but decided to, as a neighbor said, you started out in the skies and then now you're on the ground, so it's a lot of this polarity that you find in biodynamics. So that's really interesting. Um, but I just happened across biodynamics when I was studying agriculture in Minnesota. That's where my original childhood home was. And I compared two farms. One was a conventional corn, soybeans, peas for Green Giant, like a vegetable canner, and conventional. And then the other happened to be a CSA in Wisconsin that was practicing biodynamics. And I compared the two and asked each one, what do you consider good farming? And each of them had an answer. And so I came away with a lot of respect for the conventional farm, but I ended up having more interest and more favor towards the biodynamic farm. It just really spoke to me and was kind of the missing piece. I was studying agronomy and it I was learning a lot, but it just kind of left me still with some questions. I think I can talk about it more, but there's a gap in what agronomy was teaching me. And so I was at that farm, and then I ended up moving to that farm for about 2 years. Um, and then, life happens, and then you meet somebody special in your life. And my wife is from originally from Omaha, Nebraska, and uh, and then we ended up settling then down in just outside of Lincoln, Nebraska. Um, and Yeah, so we settled down in Nebraska and started our own farm. And shortly after starting the farm, well, we got certified organic, certified biodynamic as soon as we could. And then shortly after that, Ann Mendenhall was the director of Demeter at the time, put out the call saying, are any biodynamic farmers interested in becoming inspectors? And so that opened the doorway, and there was an organic inspector training about 10 miles from my house, which was like, well, if this is the time, it's going to happen. Now is the time to do it. So I ended up taking the training and did a lot of inspections right in the Midwest, and kind of covered that for Demeter for a number of years. Um, and then simultaneously had a farm going, so I was traveling and farming. Thanks to my family and my wife for holding the farm down while I was off traveling a couple 2 to 3 or I think 1 year at the most. I was traveling a month out of the year. I tried to get everything put into the fall though, so that it wasn't so busy for farming. Um, but yeah, and then I inspected for a good number of years, And then at one point, the call came out for a director of certification for Demeter. That was about 5.5 years ago, and the rest is history.
Could you tell us more about your farm?
Yeah, it's about 20 acres that we own, just outside of Lincoln, Nebraska. Most of it's in pasture. At our peak, we had probably about 3 acres of vegetables. Now we're down to probably maybe quarter to a half of an acre that we just raise a little bit of produce on, but we have chickens for eggs, beef, cattle. We raise a few hogs and have raised lots of plants. Um, that's one of the biggest enterprises on the farm right now, um, which is kind of ironic because we were raising our plants for ourselves when we had like a 80-member CSA with the farm, and we did farmers market and restaurant accounts and wholesale and all that. And we had a few plants left over, and we were putting up a sign at the end of the driveway, said, "Hey, we got plants." And then the driveway gravel got noisy, and next thing we know, there's a whole new enterprise. But now
Are
we
you,
raise more plants for other people than we raise for ourselves.
wow. And so are you growing mostly vegetable starts or fruit trees or native plants?
Mostly vegetable starts, herbs, and some flowers. But yeah, all plant starts for people to take home and put into their own gardens. And that's partly, we have cattle, so we have the manure for the compost, and then that goes into roughly, a third to half of the compost, depending on the compost, is the potting mix. And so I like to, and I use the, biodynamic compost preparations in the compost, and I even spray it with the 500 because I figure that that's these plants are getting started, so they should have all those preparations available. And and then I like to think of it as we're sending off these little pots with biodynamic compost in them around the community, and just spreading the biodynamic impulse far and wide. And we have some people that come from clear across the state. We've had people come from Iowa and South Dakota.
They
So
know the
it's really
difference.
they do, and we often get stories telling us about how amazing the plants do. Like they've had experience before. Like they go to Walmart or Costco or Walgreens or Ace or something like that and get plants there, and then see the result, and then they come to our place and buy our plants and see the result, and consistently, and then they come back again and again. It's like your plants do amazing. Um, so I like to think it's the biodynamic influence here.
I think that's something that's interesting to note that probably a lot of people don't think about. Biodynamics is this holistic approach to farming. And even when you're working with containerized plants, little baby plants in trays or cells or little pots, the way that you make your potting soil blend, the inclusion of your preparations, the biodynamic preparations, inclusion of manure-based compost from your farm, that's a very different blend according to, let's say the conventional farmer who has all the best practices from the local university, and the soil mix that they have has the little, BBs of fertilizer, and it has peat moss that was maybe unsustainably harvested from some northern region, and then all the inclusion of all of these other synthetic ingredients, and that is that's what you'll find in the majority of garden centers across the country, is that kind of synthetic based potting mix but it's a requirement of biodynamic farms, and obviously what you're doing on your farm is to use as many ingredients as you can source from the farm, namely your compost and your preparations that you're making there. And then you do have to import small amounts of other potting mix, like you said, to add that good drainage and that good texture to the soil, right?
Yep. Yep. Yeah. Straight compost doesn't work.
Right. Right.
That's an experiential tidbit there.
So what would you say, Everett, sorry, to get into kind of like the science behind, if you get this comment and you get this sort of anecdotal evidence that plants that get a start in potting soil that was prepared with the preparations and lovingly tended to, these plants get a really great start. What do you think a scientist would say about the difference between that potting mix that you made and the start that those plants get versus the ones that get a start in conventional soil?
Well, early in my learning about biodynamics, I went to the Michael Fields Agricultural Institute. They had a 2-week intensive training, and Bruce Blevins was one of the guys that was kind of, and Walter Goldstein were the instructors. And Bruce said, it's really important how your plants get started, because if you're not treating those little babies the best possible way, then you're going to be transplanting these plants into your garden, but it's going to be like moving in juvenile delinquents. Like they don't know how to act, they don't know how to be, in the soil, and I think that's really true. I mean, we've seen now like organic seed breeding is going on, and now it's shown that conventional varieties are bred and raised in conditions that are chemically fertilized. And so those plants are being bred and raised in those environments, and that's what they learn. That's how they exist. When you're talking about organic or biodynamic, now you've got a whole new set of conditions that those plants need. Now there's a biological communication that needs to happen between the plant and the soil, and those varieties conventionally raised don't have they aren't multilingual. They know how to speak chemical, they don't know how to speak biological.
Yeah.
And so to me, I think with biodynamic, it's the same way. And I think I'm really intrigued. Walter Goldstein's been doing some research with corn, and corn hybrids, and raised in biodynamic conditions. And what I've seen of his work, it's absolutely amazing. I mean, he's showing a side by side of pictures of, here's the conventional corn under a microscope, and you can see the vascular structures of the plant, and it's just liquid moving inside of the vessels, basically. And then he shows the biodynamic cornbread plant, and it is full of microbes. Like it's like a super highway going in these vascular systems of the plant. I mean, that is just like blows my mind. That those plants are completely different from one to the other. So I think it's really important how those plants get a start, and I think that's what people experience in our plants. And we've heard that we used to do farmers market for 25 years, and would sell a bunch of produce and plants, and we got the same stories all the time. It's anecdotal. We didn't do research, but you stand at a booth for 25 years and you have people come up to you and say, your produce is just amazing. And they buy some produce from somebody else and they put it in the fridge, and they bought some lettuce from us and they put it in the fridge. They can't eat our stuff fast enough. They just they're attracted to it. And then if they do keep it around, like, oh, I forgot it in the crisper drawer. And then somebody was like, somebody was telling us a month later they found the lettuce in the crisper drawer, and they thought, oh, it's just going to be worthless. And it's like, it was fine. And so you hear enough of those stories, and it's just there's it may to a scientist, it may be anecdotal, but it's only anecdotal because it hasn't been, scientifically, the rigor of the scientific method hasn't been applied to it.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
So I'll ask a big question now, Everett. If you could, what is Demeter and Demeter certification?
Yeah, so Demeter Association, or sometimes called Demeter USA, is the certifier of biodynamic agriculture, food processing, compost production, commercial compost production, and textiles in the United States. We are part of a global federation called the Biodynamic Federation, Demeter International, and the biodynamic standards then are set out of that kind of that federation type impulse in the world. So member countries with certifiers, and then like the Biodynamic Association, for instance, now is a member of the federation, and there's biodynamic associations around the world that are a part of the federation, and so everybody gets together in what's called the members assembly, and the global community sets the international biodynamic standard, and so that's what those standards are, what the U.S. standard is based on. There's a few nuances, especially with wine, that are unique from the global standards, but by and large, the U.S. standards match the federal or the international standard. And so, yes, we're the certifier in the United States, and we have a very similar process for certification that organic does. So we have an application process. We review the application. We'll send out inspectors on site, and then we make a certification decision on whether the farm is certified at the end of the day. The standards are divided into farm and processing, and then there's a labeling standard for products. There's also a commercial compost standard, and a beekeeping standard. And all those can be found on our homepage on the website. And now, you asked what is biodynamic certification? How deep do we want to go into the weeds of like the farm standard or processing standard?
Well, I think we don't need to do the exact details at this point, because we have to get done sometime today. So, but how would you compare and contrast an organic certification compared to a biodynamic certification?
Sure, we use organic as a base. So if somebody's Demeter certified, there's two options. You can either be certified organic, and then we'll use that to cover kind of the foundational criteria. And if you're not, then we'll use Demeter will actually do the organic verification independent. It doesn't result in a certified organic status, because that you need to be accredited by the USDA. But it will result in a standalone biodynamic certification. And so some of the differences would be Demeter requires 10% of the farm be devoted to biological diversity. So the map kind of behind Garett there is a good example as a backdrop of biodiversity and how that works in. You have the ponds, the trees, the orchards can even be a biodiversity area, or vineyards, where you're planting a cover crop in the vineyard, and then the key is that it needs to flower. That's like Demeter's criteria of what is biodiversity. So the goal is to support the beneficial insects that are needed for a healthy farm organism, is what we call it. And that's another difference between organic and biodynamic, is that Demeter focuses on a farm organism. We look at the whole farms, and it's a requirement to certify the whole farm. We don't do field by field. We don't do crop by crop. It is a whole farm certification. And we really look at the farm as that organism of like an entity that is has integrity, has a boundary, and what is going on to self-sustain or create fertility cycles within the farm itself. Um, the ideal biodynamic farm is one that requires no imported fertility products. That is an ideal. It's obtainable mostly, but it is a very difficult ideal to reach entirely. Um, and so there are, but we do look at that. There are limitations in terms of the fertility that can be imported onto a farm. Um, that's a different aspect than organic, where there's no restrictions on how much fertility you can bring in. And there's a reality there that, you can import all this fertility into a farm and you can create this Garden of Eden, and have it be entirely based on off-farm fertility, off-farm inputs, importing all your carbon, all that. The difference on a biodynamic farm is that Garden of Eden is created from within the resources of the farm itself as much as possible. And if you think about the larger picture there, there's a carbon footprint involved with the former, where you're importing everything. And so you may create good carbon in your soil, but I would argue that it's not regenerating carbon in your soil. It's just importing it in. And so that's a key focus, is create the paradise from within the farm itself. There's sunlight. That's the main factor that's going to regenerate the farm. Livestock integration is another requirement. It's not always a possibility. People don't have the husbandry skills. People don't have the land base. People don't have a person there to actually be there on the farm and watch over the livestock. But we do have creative ways of integrating livestock where people can bring in guest animals from somebody else's farm. And so you still get that animal impact, that animal influence on the soil, which is, if you're thinking about ecosystems or organisms, every ecosystem in the world has some livestock component to it, whether it's a desert, whether it's an ocean, Antarctica, the prairies, the forests, there's always an animal component. And so this interaction between soil and animals is really critical. Use of the biodynamic preparations is another requirement with biodynamic certification. And those are probably one of the more difficult things to explain to people, of like, how do you understand what those are? But it is a requirement. The compost preparations need to be applied. The field sprays need to be applied. And yeah. And then, so that's on the farm side. And then on the processing side, organic has one processing standard, and that applies to everything that gets processed. The biodynamic processing standard has different category. There's a general category that applies to everything, but then there's a section for each food group, because it's recognizing that biodynamic food, one thing that is different than kind of the conventional wisdom is that the food has living vitality, and there are ways to preserve that, and then there are ways that can destroy that. And microwave ovens, for example, would be a good way to destroy the living vitality in the foods. So biodynamic processing standard, no microwave ovens. That's not an option. But each type of product has its own uniqueness that needs special care. Gentle processing is the way we word it in the standard, to preserve the vitality of those foods, in the products. So yeah, each type. So there's wine, there's spirits, there's vegetables, there's grains, flours, herbs, There's a cosmetic standard. There's a textile standard, um, and and the yeah. So trying to think. Yeah.
Well, as a practicing biodynamic farmer, I think it's one of the most misunderstood types of farming out there. I think if you came to Troon and you pulled into the parking area and looked around, I don't know if there's anything that would say, "Oh, this is biodynamic," other than the fact that it's perhaps greener and shaggier than a lot of other farms. It doesn't have the bare dirt. But
Right.
both you and Garrett came with an academic and scientific background. And how
Mhm.
does that background affect both of your approaches and understanding of biodynamics?
Mm.
Right. Well, to me, my academics was very much steeped in the scientific method. Studying agronomy, studying food science, and it's often said that biodynamics is pseudoscience, and and to me, that's a misunderstanding of what the scientific method is. The scientific method is you have a hypothesis, you create, this theory, and then you apply a methodology to verify what you think is like, cause and effect. Um, the source, I think where it becomes pseudoscience for biodynamics is that Rudolf Steiner, the initial lecturer, the founder, the lecturer that founded the biodynamic method, um, didn't stop at applying a science to the agronomy. He actually was wanting to apply a science to where do these hypotheses come from? There's an inspiration that a scientist has, and they're not ridiculed as being pseudoscientific because they had an inspiration and they want to go check it out. But they don't necessarily talk about the inspiration. They just develop their hypothesis and do the testing. But Steiner was the same way. I mean, he gave these lectures, and sometimes they sound really, really far out. And it's focusing on how he came to those inspirations. And but he was very clear, don't just trust me. Don't just believe it because I'm saying it. Go out there and test it out, and make and verify that it works. Um,
Which is, like you said, the beginning of every scientific method is a hypothesis, right? It's a conjecture about maybe how something works or what the relationship might be. And Steiner proposed a lot of these relationships and sort of solutions or practices to farming. But you're absolutely right. He said, go out and test this. Don't just take my word for it. Experiment and, get that learn that language of quantitative science of weight and measure and number and bring that back to the practice of spiritual science. But it all starts with that hypothesis and that question, that suggestion of trying to figure out how something works.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, and Steiner diverged from kind of the modern scientific community in that he was applying the scientific method to spiritual occurrences or spiritual ideas. One thing that I think is very important to understand with Steiner is different terminologies.
Yeah.
So, when we're saying spiritual, oftentimes I find people have this understanding of religion, and they're synonymous. There's no difference. With Steiner, they were very different. Um, the having a thought to Steiner was a spiritual experience, was a spiritual activity. Having a conversation is a spiritual uh, example. Um, from my perspective, my understanding is that religion would be the recognition of the spiritual in the world. So it comes down to, a Christian practice or a Jewish practice or a Muslim or a Hindu or all these different religious practices is about recognizing the spiritual in the world. And that's where there should be that freedom. People should be able to have their own relationship with the spiritual in the world, which that's a modern day phrase. That's a modern day experience. It used to be that in the old days, the church and the Pope, and well, maybe edit that part out. That would be controversial. Yeah, so in the old days, the religious awareness came from a centralized person or organization, and that was the masses' experience of religion. It was kind of something that was handed down. And then, Luther came into the picture and put his decree on the door of the Catholic Church and said, you can have your own relationship with your spiritual creator. And so there's just been this progression over through humanity's time of different relationships with religion. But that's a key difference between spiritual and religious in from Steiner's perspective.
Yeah. I see one important role as a scientist, having come from a scientific background, studied soil science at UC Davis. I also faced a lot of skepticism during my couple of years there. Skepticism from faculty, from staff, from other researchers who considered biodynamics to be no different from an organic treatment. They said, it's the same. You're going to get the same results. Like, there's no use testing biodynamic separate from organic. Just do your conventional test and do your, organic or biodynamic tests, whatever you want to call it. But that was the skepticism that didn't see it as any different. I think their thought, to maybe paraphrase the skepticism, was around, what difference does it make to add these minuscule little amounts of these preparations to the soil? What is that going to really do? And I think it's our job as scientists and as researchers to tease that out, to ask that question. What is the role of the preparations in soil fertility? What is the role of the preparations in promoting vitality? How do we define that? Is that shelf stability? Is that a plant's resistance to pest or disease and its ability to support, some sort of outside attack? Is it nutrient content, which we can measure in plants? It's I think our role as scientists to really bear that out and to ask the questions. And something that I'm really interested in terms of the future of biodynamic research is developing better questions to get at questions like, what are the role of the preparations? And I also feel that there may be, as there was in Steiner's time, a need for development of either novel scientific instrumentation or testing methods. Steiner proposed qualitative test methods like sensitive crystallization or chromatography, or these sort of more pictorial qualitative measures, which modern science and your universities, worldwide, are not necessarily adhering or that are as interested in this qualitative approach to testing hypotheses as Steiner was. And so I think, I reflect on where science holistically, defined here, where that was 100 years ago when Steiner was lecturing. If this is 1924, for example, the best optics in the world, the best microscopes in the world could barely see microorganisms, let alone define them or understand what their role in soil health or plant resistance or vitality might be. And now, fast forward 100 years later, and we can sequence all of these microbes and we can look at their DNA and we can understand a horizontal gene transfer between different microorganisms. And we just have a much better understanding of biology. Whereas, there was not an awareness in the early 20th century of the role, or let alone really barely the existence of microorganisms. And so I
Mhm.
think, you're right to talk about the importance of language. And I just want to also call attention to just where we were at in terms of our scientific understanding of agriculture at the time. There wasn't, prior to the early 20th century, the existence of any sort of synthetic fertilizer. It was the Haber-Bosch process that came about in Germany to invent synthetic nitrogen, to pull nitrogen out of the atmosphere and use a lot of energy and pressure and heat to convert that into ammonium and nitrate, which we now understand to be commonly used nitrogen fertilizers globally. And prior
Mhm.
to that time period, it just didn't exist. So anyway, I think it's important to focus on language, and it's important to focus on those questions. And as we seek to better understand biodynamics, that we're developing whole new models of language. And I think that's something that biodynamics really presents an opportunity to dig into.
Yes, I mean, Steiner made it clear that he meant the lectures as a starting point, and then we were supposed to go out and research and learn. And there's so much more we know now about energy and the way it works in the soils and things like mycorrhizal systems. Everett, how do you see that affecting moving biodynamics forward?
Yeah, well, first off, one thing I want to share, like, what are the odds? I did some traveling in what's now Poland, where the lectures were originally given, in Kauberwitz, Germany at the time, but now it's Kauberwice, Poland. And the where Steiner gave the lectures was just about a 20-minute train ride from it's now Wrocław, but it used to be Breslau, and that's where the synthetic nitrogen was actually birthed. Was where, like, just miles away from where Steiner gave his agriculture lectures, and it's like, what are the odds? And But yeah, I think that difference in language is really an important thing, because one thing, like in the lecture, Steiner was talking about adding this stinging nettle compost preparation to your pile, and he talked about it as giving your manure more intelligence,
Hmm.
and then applying that compost to your soil, and then bringing more intelligence to your soil. And I remember first learning about biodynamics, and I thought, this is weird. Like, this is puzzle. I don't get it. But so many times I find with, like, what Steiner writes or what he spoke of at the time, I think, if it doesn't make sense, just let it be. Don't judge it, don't ridicule it, like, say that's not possible. And then for me, my own experience with that was, 30 years later, it occurs to me, oh, Steiner said bring more intelligence to your soil, but now we talk about the symbiotic soil plant and microbe relationships. Like a microbe can access minerals in the soil that the plant can't access. And the plant can feed sugars from its photosynthesis to the and feed those sugars to the microbes in exchange for the minerals in the soil. It's this back and forth, this communication, and the plant actually kind of puts in a request order to the microbe saying, I need this mineral, and then the mineral provides it and gets the sugars. And there's this like almost like an active awareness between the microbe and the plant. And to me, if I think about that, I mean, that's intelligence. This
Yeah.
communication, like, oh, here's my the microbe saying I need sugars in order to survive, and I can help you out, and the plant saying I need this mineral, I can help you out. That's the beginning of intelligence, is communication. um, so
And
so then it doesn't seem so far off. Steiner was using the language that he had available to him, and then science in the modern day has progressed, and we've learned way more than we used to know. Um, but sometimes you just have to, translate from one era to another era.
And from one species to another species as well, as you're saying, we're using the English language to communicate with each other and communicate some pretty heady ideas. But if you think about the exchange of these biochemicals, microbes releasing molecules that communicate to the plants, hey, send me some sugars, like we're down here, we're hungry. That biochemical communication is not unlike, we're also emitting pheromones out into the air, right? And other humans are picking them up, whether they're consciously aware of them or not. That's a form of biochemical signaling. Um, that it's a form of language, it's a form of communication, and I would totally agree with you, Everett. It's a form of intelligence to see the communication between plants and microorganisms. And I would argue to people as well that we're all communicating. The insect world sees in different wavelengths of light than humans see. And I think the wavelength of light that plants have learned to emit through their flowers and through their forms are communicating to, bees and butterflies and moths and insects in a whole nother language that we're only just starting to get insight into using, more modern instrumentation and really creative thought processes to better understand the relationships between plants and animals and microorganisms and the soil, that kind of mineral component. We're only just getting insights now, 100 years later, and you're right. It's so important to pay attention to the language that was used 100 years ago, and maybe just I think it's important to not throw the baby out with the bathwater. I'd speak to my skeptical colleagues at UC Davis who wanted to write biodynamics off because Steiner mentioned gnomes or fairies or something like that. And for my
Mhm.
personal interpretation, as I kind of let that be over the last decade of practicing, what I feel I have arrived at is the idea that these microorganisms that live in the soil that we didn't even know about, that Steiner likely didn't even know existed, let alone what their role in soil is, that these are the gnomes and fairies. These are the unseen heroes, the unsung and unseen heroes of soil fertility that he attributed to more of this mystical world rather than a material microorganism, a bacteria, fungi, whatever it might be.
Yeah, it seems.
If you talk about like a gnome or a fairy and you treat it more of like a parable,
Yeah.
then
Mhm.
it's not that it's necessarily you know precisely of like fairies with wings and that sort of thing, but uh the actual effect or the role or the process or that's really what that pictorial um understanding of the world was. And it was a different time when those stories were created, and so that was their personal relationship with their environment. Times moved on. We have a scientific method. We're much more materialistic in our science, in our understandings, and what we value. And yeah, so different times. We need to almost have like a language and culture translator from the medieval days and the Christian, pre-Christian days to the modern days.
Hey, it seems that as agricultural science is progressing, it seems more and more to validate many of the concepts in biodynamics. You see now they're using silica as a common applicant in strawberries and things to build cell wall strength and things like that, which of course is 501, one of the biodynamic
Right.
preparations. So I think that's where this language really comes in. I think it's a great point.
Mhm. And I think one of the aspects of the preparations is that they influence things. It's to think that it's going to be a materialistic influence is a stretch. It's not completely out of the realm. Like corn manure, for example, the 500 preparation, that's applied at a quarter cup per acre. That's at a rate that is lower than some of the new modern day herbicides. And we don't question that the herbicides are having an effect. You can go out there and see that. Yet the biodynamic preparations do ask someone to appreciate that maybe there's more to more to it than just the materialism. You
Mhm.
know, if you start talking about human interactions, then you have yes, there's physical interaction that you can have with people, but there's also an emotional interaction, and where how does that translate into effects? A very small influence can result in a very huge impact. Um,
Of course, there's
and
billions and
so
billions of
that's
microorganisms in that quarter cup of 500.
right, right. Yep. Yeah, there definitely is a material effect, but
Yeah,
Steiner asks people to recognize that maybe there's more. Maybe
yes.
there's more to just than the material.
Yeah, I often think people think of 500 as fertilizer when really it's more of a bringing energy to the forces that are naturally in the soil.
Mhm. Yeah, and if you think about bringing a little bit of energy in terms of like if you think about your farm going in a certain direction, and then a preparation brings an influence, and it's not a bulldozer coming through and changing things, it's just like a little nudge. And over time, then that little nudge can result in some pretty significant changes.
Everett, can we dig into what some of those changes are and what some of the scientific findings have been? You mentioned Walter Goldstein and this very biologically active corn. What are some of the other findings when it comes to nutritional outcomes or shelf stability or yeah, what some of the can you paraphrase some of the other research that's been going on?
I'm not an expert in all the research, but a few things that I have encountered. A new study did a stress test on cucumbers, and they had conventional, organic, and biodynamic raised cucumbers. And the stress test was scarring the cucumbers and seeing how the longevity of the cucumber after the injury. And the study clearly showed that the conventional cucumbers succumbed to the injury much quicker than the organic, and the biodynamic succumbed to the injury much later than the organic. So, uh, um, and I think that is when I saw that study, I was like, yes, that's it. That I've been saying it for a long time now that biodynamics is about food vitality. And whether or not a cucumber succumbs to an injury is all about that vitality. You know, we look at a plant and we can say, okay, that plant's living, and then you cut it off, and like, is that plant still alive? Like, well, it's still the moisture's still there. I pulled a mustard plant out of kind of a hedgerow uh, one time, and we had cloudy weather for like 2, 3 days after that, and some rain, and so the mustard never died. It was laying on top of the grass, and the it was starting to flower, and the flower head started turning up. So to me, that was like, this is the mustard's still alive. Yes, it's not in the soil, but it's still alive. Um, and and then if you dry something, there's still a vitality that is contained within the dried herb. Um, but say like you have an apple or something, then, is that apple still alive? I would say yes. And that's conventional. That's like, materialistically acknowledged, because what do you do if you want your apple to store longer? You put it in climate controlled storage. You slow down the respiration of that fruit. And so it is alive. And if you don't acknowledge that, you're going to end up with a shriveled up, moldy apple on your counter. Um, so that stress test to me was like so exciting, to see that, like, okay, here's a way that we can test food vitality without asking people to accept a new like chromatography or sensitive crystallization and what that's about. I think those are very valuable and very worthwhile pursuits, but it asks people to accept something that they're not comfortable with necessarily. But this stress test, I was like, that's it. There's that's vitality. What else? There was a study out in Washington State that tested compost and the different. They made two piles. Everything was exactly the same. They even redid the study because when they did the valerian preparation over the biodynamic pile, they didn't sprinkle plain water over the other pile. So they redid it because that was an inconsistency. And what they found was more nitrogen was retained in the biodynamically treated pile. More carbon was retained in the biodynamic pile. The temperature spiked quicker in the biodynamic pile. And the unreported, unscientific story I heard from the researcher was that the fox preferred the biodynamic pile as well to lay on as opposed to the non-biodynamic pile. So I think, people talk about not appreciating like these preparations and that they're going to have an impact on the compost, but it's scientifically proven that they do have an influence.
That story you were just talking about, Everett, I don't know if you know this, but Lynn Carpenter Boggs is the researcher at Washington State, and we had her on the podcast, and she told that story actually about her research, and we asked that question, or I guess she posed the question, what does the fox know, right? What does the fox know that we, as the most modern researchers with not all the funding, actually, there's a severe lack of funding for biodynamic research, but with funding and access to the most amazing laboratories at Washington State University, how can we actually detect what the fox knows? What did the fox sense in that? Was it truly that the pile was 1 degree warmer, or was there something else, less material that the fox was sensing? So I encourage everybody to go back and listen to that episode. What does the fox know with Lynn Carpenter Boggs? Because she's produced some really compelling research.
Yeah, yeah, and but yeah, there is a stigma though with biodynamic research in the United States, and that it is pseudoscience, and so if people are doing research, then they're kind of dabbling into this weirdness, and that's hopefully we can get that turned around. And there is research going on in Germany. That it's much more widely accepted, Demeter and biodynamic certification. Dr. Jürgen Fritz has been doing a lot of research, and just really trying to untangle this. Like, Steiner said this, and then how do we put that into a scientific study? And I've seen some really, really interesting work from him. Just trying to bring some of these a more materialistic scientific approach to the indications that Steiner gave, and I think that's where it's going to start.
Yeah, at Geisenheim in Germany, the cultural school where biodynamics is part of the curriculum. It's just a course you can take. It's very different than the United States.
Right.
Garett, go ahead.
On the certification side, it really strikes me that in Germany alone, there's thousands of certified biodynamic farms. And to give you a perspective, Germany is about the size of Montana. So imagine Montana with a couple thousand biodynamic farms.
Right. Garett, you've actually seen some soil results in your own testing here.
Yes. Yeah, we've been really impressed, actually. And I can say that I was really impressed myself having arrived here in 2021. I have a master's in soil science from UC Davis. And what I did in the first year that I was here, the first full season in 2022, was I went back to some soil pits that were dug in 2018 when Troon was purchased by new owners, and y'all hired a incredible soil scientist named Dr. Paul Anamosa, who's based in Napa, and he and his colleagues came out here to Troon and dug about one soil pit per acre. About 75 pits were examined. The soil was taken to the laboratory, and both qualitative, quantitative measures of all kinds of metrics of soil health. That was really centered on planning the replanting project. What I did in 2022 in my first year here was go back to those same coordinates, or close to the same coordinates, that Dr. Anamosa pulled those samples from, and tested them again and asked that question of what was the influence of our first 4 years of biodynamic farming on these various metrics of soil health. And we found some pretty staggering and interesting results. I think the most interesting, well, first of all, we saw an increase in organic matter at every single sample. And I believe it was 47 out of 48 samples. We looked at the top 8 inches, sort of the most active, most biologically alive soil profile. We looked at 8 to 18 inches deep, and we looked at 18 to 36 inches deep, these different soil horizons that have different soil properties, different amounts of clay, different amounts of water, whatever. And they also had different amounts of organic matter. And that first finding that every single sample we pulled, except for one, had increased in soil organic matter was just out the gates, pretty compelling results to suggest that biodynamics is sequestering carbon, and most importantly, sequestering it deep in the soil where it's more stable. You know, that surface soil, that top 8 inches, is more active, especially if you have any sort of tillage or cultivation practice on your farm. Tilling the soil will tend to release more organic matter, or sort of oxidize or burn off more organic matter due to microbes um, uh, accessing it. And what we found was that the most carbon sequestered in any of the samples was down at that deepest 18 to 36 inch deep soil. So, you know, we're talking almost 3 feet deep. These plant roots are growing. And we looked in our apple orchard, we looked in the vineyards, we looked in a non-irrigated pasture, we looked in the vegetable garden, and in all of these different systems, regardless of the amount of compost that was applied, or regardless of the amount of tillage that happened, cover crops or not, annual veggies versus perennial, fruit trees and vines. And across the board, we saw the most carbon sequestered at depth. And so it told us that what we were doing was feeding biology. You know, you so clearly explained that relationship between plants feeding sugars produced by photosynthesis and microbes releasing those minerals back to the plant, and that constant exchange that's happening with a living plant in the ground all year round. That interaction is happening, and it's especially happening at depth. And so a lot of research, no-till research or carbon cycle research, is showing that a lot of that activity, that carbon sequestration, will bear out at lower depths, and be more and be held in the soil more long term, more sort of recalcitrant carbon in the soil. So to me, that source of carbon in the soil, that's food for microbes. That's food for them to continually do the work that they do of releasing minerals back to the plants and completing that exchange, that beautiful part of the relationship. So yeah, suffice it to say that we were really impressed by the first 4 years. And again, that was in 2022 that we took those samples. We're following up next year in 2026. Every 4 years, we'll go back and revisit those samples. That's a recommendation that is also made at UC Davis. It's made by the regenerative organic certification folks, that you don't go back and sample, but every 3 to 5 years. those changes can be so nuanced and so subtle, and we're talking about a percent or less on an annual basis. And if you're sampling your soil every year and looking at soil organic matter, you can kind of get some noisy data, but we're interested in going back every 4 years. So hold tight, but we'll have some more updated data next year as to how our first 8 years of biodynamic practice have influenced various metrics of soil health. Pretty exciting research.
Yeah, yeah, it is.
And I would add, that I often tell people that, the proof is in the pudding. People as skeptics or people, not even skeptics, even people who are totally open to experiencing vitality. Craig talked about earlier, you come onto to our farm, you might not know that it's biodynamic, but you might feel that there's more insect life buzzing around you, or you might hear more diversity of birds while you're sitting out in the garden tasting wine, or you might notice something about the wine and the living quality of the wine. And I mean, again, if I think about my role as a scientist, I want to drill down and ask that question, what is it about the farm? What do the fox know? What does the birds and the insects know that drive them to this property and in really incredible abundance and diversity? Can we actually sense and detect something in the air that attracts these organisms? Can we detect the polyphenols and these aromatic compounds in the wines to start to tease out what brings such vibrance and vitality to the wines? And, there's that material approach, and then there's a non-material approach. And I encourage people to sort of suspend their disbelief and just experience that glass of wine or experience what they feel in the tasting room garden. And you feel it when you go to a mature biodynamic farm. It's palpable for just about anybody who's paying attention. And I imagine, Everett, you've experienced some of that on your farm, and you're more than, what was it, 25 years you've been there tending that land?
Yeah, yep, yep. Yeah, I would agree with that, and I would say that each person has their own experience of that vitality, of that sense of what's going on in a place. Like we had a ornithologist come and did some bird counts, and he developed a concept. His name was John Quinn. Has developed a concept called Healthy Farm Index. And essentially, it was like you count the number of birds on your farm, and that'll tell you how healthy your farm is. And and we had him out because we noticed when we arrived here that we had very few birds. On 20 acres, we would see maybe an occasional robin. Um, and then 15 years later, I think when we had him come, between his count and our count, I think he counted 41 different birds. Um, and then we had our own list, and so we had like 61 different birds that we could add to his count. Um, and and I was like, well, is this just normal? Like, does this just happen? Like, is it going to happen down the road, for example, where there's other like properties? And he said, no, it's because of what you're doing. That's what's creating this bird kind of paradise. And you come at the right time of the day, like you come at daybreak, and the whole farm is just like, oh my gosh, it's like this bird concert going on. It's just absolutely noisy, wakes you up in the morning, and that sort of experience. And so really, I mean, it just occurred to me that maybe like understanding what this palpable experience of what a biodynamic farm is, you might have to bring a sociologist and an anthropologist into the picture
Mhm.
to understand kind of like what is it that people are picking up on. We always think about agronomy for or soil science or like to understand what biodynamics is about, but that's not there's not a boundary there for biodynamics. People have their own individual experiences. That's like there's just something there. Um, whether it's eating the food, whether it's smelling something, whether it's feeling the space of the farm and the healing that can come from visiting. Yeah, it's very it's a whole farm certification after all with Demeter.
Well, I think it's something that people, we always talk about the soil and the plants, but what I've really seen is that by practicing biodynamics, it changes the people and the culture of the people working there. And that, I think that really expresses that whole farm concept. It's not just the soil and the plants, it's the people that work them. It's all part of one organism.
Yeah, if you consider your farm an organism, then the people are a part of the organism. And so yeah, the it makes a lot of sense that Demeter added the social responsibility criteria to the standard. Um, that you have to take care of the plant and the animal and the human community.
So we believe very much that certification is important. It's certainly the most effective way to communicate to the consumer what they're actually buying. What are your obviously, you believe in certification as the director of certification. What do you think of the important elements of becoming certified?
So there's a number of values and importances. So from my own experience, when I got certified back in the late 90s, there was very little awareness about biodynamics in Nebraska. There was one other farm that was about 50 miles from here. And so really the main reason why I got certified was because I wanted to have the credentials given by Demeter to say, this is a certified biodynamic farm. It's not just me, some crazy hippie off in the hills that's practicing back to the land agriculture. I wanted to be able to say we're certified biodynamic and this is what it means. And with certification, then there's a standard. And so when you say I'm certified biodynamic, you can go back to this, anybody can go back to the standard and say, these are the standards that are being met. This is what a biodynamic farm looks like. These are the requirements. And I think when you get into the marketplace and the consumer trust that gets put in to their when somebody buys a food product or produce, then you're having to stretch across this boundary of the consumer in the store doesn't know the farmer that's producing the food, and so there's this standard that they can rely on for the food that they're purchasing. So I think it's certification is especially important in that type of situation. Um, yeah.
So we became certified just before you took over, and I would say we've really seen the process streamlined over the last years, and it's interesting working, becoming certified organic. They don't really care if you do it or not. But working with the team at Demeter, obviously you believe you want people to become certified. So it's more of a partnership. It's very different than an organic certification.
Yeah, and I'm glad to hear that it's been streamlined. I liked, when I took the job, I felt like I had a pretty good mix of experience. I'd been a certified organic farmer, biodynamic farmer for decades. I've also been an inspector and now working as the director of certification. So bringing all of those things together and really having like, you have to make it easier on the farmer and the processor that's applying for certification. So I'm glad to hear that. And then there is, like we still, as a certifier, don't want to consult. Like we don't want to, tell it you should be doing this. We do have a list of folks that we can send that are happy to consult and are aware of the Demeter standards. So we still have this kind of firewall between consulting and certification, but that's not to say that just educating the licensees or the certified farms and processors about the standards. That's something that a certifier should be doing, of educating about the standards. And so that's like the mission of Demeter is to help people farm successfully using the biodynamic standards. Um, and so there is still a lot of education that can happen as the certifier. And yes, we do want people to be certified, and we do want that consistency in the marketplace, so that when somebody buys a biodynamic product or produce, that they know what it is. There's going to be a quality and an integrity that can back that up. Um, I think that's really where it comes is people actually experiencing biodynamic food. Then there's something that is attractive, something that brings them back, and something they want to bring into their life. You
Ever-
Go ahead, Garrett.
Well, yeah, speaking of that, I wanted to ask you about what biodynamics has brought into your life. You shared with us recently that I think a moment of pride is that you've been raising cattle on your land for 25 years and you're now first sourcing your first cow horns from your farm. Cow horns are used, hopefully buried on every biodynamic farm out there. We have about 60 or 70 of them buried out here in a pit we prepared that we'll use on our 100-acre farm. So quite a few cow horns are used, and after being a practitioner for more than 2 decades, you proudly told us the other day that you've sourced your first cow horns from your farm. What has your journey and your experience with biodynamics brought into your life? Um, yeah.
Boy, that's a hard nutshell to provide. Um, but it does give you a longer term perspective. Like having those cattle on the farm. I mean, you have your cattle. We started out with some Jerseys. We've brought in like a low line Angus, a Murray Grey, a Hereford. Now we've got a Devon, a brown Devon. Um, and so bringing horned genetics into the herd has proven to be a little bit of a challenge because jerseys have horns, but then some of these other ones don't necessarily have horns. So trying to select for that and have that goal in mind for this long. But then yeah, finally getting there and feeling that success. Because the ideal is to have your own livestock, your own horns, your own manure. Um, And then the other thing, I think, like with making the preparations, it definitely asks a person to expand their their thinking and awareness about what's going on. Um, it's hard to put manure into a horn and bury it in the ground without asking what's going on here. There's and I think. For me, it's looking back through history, agriculture was guarded by or held by um, in many cases like a chief or a nobility or a priest would be the holders of like the crop rotation. I mean, the crop rotation was held by some type of a priestly figure. Um, and yeah, it's that type of experience, I guess that type of direct connection with nature. Um, it's eye-opening. It's almost like studying another language. Like you have the book of nature that you're trying to read. Um, and I remember hearing a lecture by Alan York back in the 90s. He said there's there's signs along the road for trying to understand nature, but the problem is they're not in English. And he said, and to many surprisement, they're not in German either.
Alan had a good
Um,
humor.
and so, yeah, trying to understand nature is a very complex thing. And in history, it's been held by um, secret societies or religious sects or um, yeah. And now here we are, farmers, every day out there trying to figure it all out and work with scientists and work with some, unusual blend of lunar calendars and farmers' almanacs and biodynamic calendars and things like that. So,
Yeah, I forget who said this, but they said biodynamics is respecting what you don't know.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's recognizing the wisdom in nature.
The
And
intelligence, maybe the
there
intelligence of
maybe
nature.
even the intelligence of nature. Yeah. Yeah. Uh, yeah. That's that's a great way of thinking about it. Um,
It's interesting in the wine business right now. A lot of the conventional wines are having sales issues and struggles, while the sales of organic and biodynamic wines are actually increasing in contrast to the rest of the market. So it seems to me these younger consumers now are very concerned, about the provenance of what they eat and what they drink. So I think the future of biodynamics seems very bright right now. The combination of modern agricultural science closing in on these things that we didn't understand, and the fact that these younger consumers care, I think that biodynamics has a very bright future.
so every now and then I like to just give myself a kind of a comparison or a benchmark. And so one time I was traveling overseas on an airplane, and you can get those, you have your meal served, and you get those little bottle of wine that you could have on the plane. So I was like, okay, I'm going to try this, run of the mill conventional airline brand of wine, and it was very shallow, very like I would say almost rigid, or it was very harsh. Um, and then I think about biodynamic wine that I have tried, that it's very complex, it's robust, it's very dynamic, and then you know the success that biodynamics has had in the wine world um, is remarkable. Um, and the recognition, there's articles that are written about it. There's a fairly big following. And when I reflect on that, I mean, some of it's promotion of biodynamics, um, but also I think the wine community has an attunement to those subtleties, those changes, the vitality, the terroir, and I think the wine world was just ready for biodynamics. It was just, of course, like this is a perfect match. Um, and we just need that same kind of awakening with cheese and milk and produce and even bread. All these different things. Like the reality is the experience is there. People can have that bite into an apple or an orange or an almond and or a glass of wine and experience that living vitality in the foods.
Our winemaker Nate Wall says that biodynamics is this lens that focuses terroir and it focuses that sense of place. And I think wine is particularly communicative in that way, sort of talkative almost. Uh, Better able to express that sort of that intelligence or that vitality maybe than you would think a tomato or an almond or whatever might be able to. But I think you're right, and I'm hopeful in what Craig is saying. I'm hopeful that a younger generation that cares about how that land was treated in order to grow that tomato, or how the welfare of that animal, or the responsibility that we have to our communities, um, that the younger generation is also optimistic about the future in their embrace of biodynamic practices, as it is this whole holistic approach to farm health, ecosystem health, nutritious food, reducing all of the negative externalities of agriculture and spraying pesticides and herbicides and all of this. Biodynamics represents this solution for the future. That is, I agree with Craig, is very bright. We just need the foodies and the people who are voting with their dollars. We're all out there doing that, making our choices of what we, feed ourselves and how we clothe our families, and what we put on our bodies and all of that sort of stuff. Yeah, I'm hopeful for the next generation as well.
Mhm.
So Everett, as we reach the end of our time here, if there's a young farmer out there that's considering biodynamics, what words of encouragement can you give them?
I think that biodynamics is going to, if it hasn't already, it's going to awaken a robust interest in the world and the natural world and your farm. Your farm is going to develop on this biodynamic journey, and you are along with it. I think that's one of the beautiful things about biodynamic. It's not just a practice that you're putting out. It's something that is a back and forth between you and your farm. And I think that personal relationship, that cultivation is, um, I think it can be there with a conventional farmer, with an organic farmer, but with biodynamics, it just kind of it brings it to another level, another layer of complexity, and it brings an awareness that can ripple out even into non-farm things that about people, like where's your inspiration coming from, and uh, and the reality is that biodynamics is one thing that Rudolf Steiner talked about late in his life, and there's a whole slew of other things, anything from architecture to medicine to education. So it's a very rich and complex um, aspect. Um, in terms of getting certified, we're trying to make that process as easy as possible. And it's a simple application that gets filled out, and then we take it from there. Sometimes, if needed, if helpful, we'll even do more of an interview style of an application, so that you get on a Zoom call and with our staff, and then you chat about your farm. And by the time you're done, you have an application that's ready to submit to Demeter. Um, and then, yeah, we'll do the inspection and and make it happen. Um,
So for those who want more information, where can they find your website and everything?
The website is www.demeter, so Demeter dash USA.org. And our contact information's on there on the page as well.
And it's a very well done website. There's a lot of information there. If you're really curious, you can really learn a lot by just going to the website. So Everett, thank you so much for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to chat, and I think you should do this more often. You tell the stories so well. They're very effective communication.
It's been a pleasure. I'm glad to do this, and yes, we can do it more often for sure.
Well, we'll look forward to that, Everett. Thank you so much for your time.
All right, thank you.